before we dive into the subject matter, I would like to start with a headline number. And the headline number is $365 billion. How many of you are using iPhone? Many of you. So $365 billion was the revenue of iPhone in 2021. Compare that number with what we have heard from Minister Rania when we were discussing about Just Finance Guidebook. In Africa, over the next 10 years, we need $250 billion to climate proof. That includes both adaptation financing as well as mitigation financing. So the money that you are paying for iPhone can actually finance the entire climate cost of Africa over the next 10 years. So let's keep that into perspective. The second point that I would like to highlight is the developing countries are in a very difficult situation and being pushed from different directions. Two such directions. One, climate finance is not flowing for mitigation, but also, more importantly, for adaptation. Adaptation financing is much lower compared to mitigation financing. That means that these countries are not in a position, given the current fiscal situation as well, not in a position to invest in resilience, invest in adaptation financing. What does that mean for business? Because we are not in a position to invest, our credit rating is going down because we are much more vulnerable to climate shocks. If our credit rating is going down, our insurance premium is going up, and the requirement for collateral is also going up, which eventually, as consumers, we will not be able to afford, which means market failure. In many countries, adaptation plans are not just adaptation plans, they're actually survival strategies. And that is the topic of our discussion. We are going to be talking about survival strategies, we are going to be talking about adaptation finance, and we are going to be talking about how to bring the private sector in adaptation financing, how we can increase the volume and the speed of delivery when it comes to adaptation financing. We have a very distinguished panel members here. We are going to start with our Honorable Minister. Our Honorable Minister will first give a keynote speech, and then we are going to dive into the discussion, and we are going to be structuring the discussion across three different buckets. The first bucket will be focusing on policy. The second bucket, we are going to be focusing on project design. And the third bucket, we are going to be talking about project financing. The challenge that we have for our panel members is to connect the dots between policy, project design, and financing, and eventually to come up with something that would resonate with the needs of the private sector, that will give a consistent and persistent market signal that there is indeed a business case behind adaptation financing. I'm going to now first request Honorable Minister, Dr. Hani, to start this discussion with his keynote remarks. Dr. Hani, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Hani Swelem. I'm the Minister of Water Resources and Irrigation in Egypt. It's not really a keynote speech. I'm just going to warm up with you with some ideas about water challenges and solutions in Egypt in relation to climate change. And the overlap, of course, with the topic of the session, which is business in the area of water. First of all, Egypt water challenges are very tied to climate change. Because in general, the impact of climate change on Egypt is happening twice. First, outside the Egyptian borders, because 97% of our water is coming from the River Nile, which means the hydrological changes or the hydrological extremes linked to climate change that happens in the Nile Basin is impacting us. As I said, 97% of our water is coming from the River Nile. Because sometimes I hear people speaking about hydrology and hydrological changes, they always think of flash flood, what you see in Cairo during the winter for 1 or 2 nights, what you see in Sinai or in the eastern side of Egypt. That's not the only hydrological changes impact. The significant hydrological changes is happening in the Nile Basin, thousands of kilometers away from Egypt. So we have to keep eye on that, and we have to think of the early warning technologies. And it's not only about the machines and the tools, it's about the capacity building our capacity and training our engineers on how to link the hydrological extremes of the Nile Basin to our farmers and to our daily use of water. So this is one side. But on the other side, you go to the north coast of Egypt, the external and the impact of the CO2 emission and the global warming on Egypt is coming also from the other side, the sea level rise. The sea level rise is a huge challenge for Egypt. Increasing the sea level rise with all the impact on the coastal zone, it also impacts our freshwater resources. And that's a very important point that many people, they don't talk about it. The increase in sea level rise, it has impact, as I said, on the coastal, north coast of Egypt, but the depletion happening in the groundwater in Egypt, especially in the north coast strip of the delta, impact the quality of the groundwater, because one level is going up, the sea level is going up, the groundwater on the other hand is going down. So there is ahead, I'm not going to go in the technical details, but there is a saltwater intrusion. So the salt water is entering into our groundwater. And that's phenomena that you might think is not important. The groundwater if you travel from Cairo to Alexandria and you see green on the right and the left side, all these areas are impacted by this phenomenon, because now, instead of pumping fresh water, these guys are now pumping saline water with a salinity that increased the 2,500 parts per million, which is quite high for the crops. It's increasing every year. So that's the external impact directly on water. The internal impact is happening in Egypt by the increasing temperature, which means every sector is using more water, and we feel it as a ministry. By the way, I'm a minister only over the last 3 weeks, so I'm very fresh. So thank you. So the increase in temperature means higher crop water requirements. Farmers are consuming more water, industry is consuming more water, and we also as a human being are consuming more water with the increase in temperature. And it's also impacting the entire agriculture process and the supply chain, etc. So these are just some aspects of impact of climate change outside the borders and inside the Egyptian borders. That's one thing. Coming to the solution, and I know you want to speak about desalination today. So I'm not going to focus on irrigation systems or canal lining or the core of the Ministry of Water Resources, because the Ministry of Water Resources still do not see desal as a part of our mandate, because we are dealing with irrigation water. We are dealing with water for food, water for agriculture. But the Ministry of Housing is more into water for drinking. So it's not our mandate to speak about drinking water. But the surprise is, I am one of the people who believes that desalination for food production is the future. Even if it sounds today for the practitioners or the industry or the business, it's too early. Yes, it's early, but it's not too early, because there are some very promising research about desalination for agriculture activities. And I don't know whether this is really the interest of the business people who are here, but I give you one very simple example, because before becoming a minister, I was promoting the idea to have a global initiative for the COP27 about the nexus, the water, energy, food nexus, with the application desalination for food security. Because imagine the photovoltaic, for example, the PV panels, the price of kilowatt hour has been reduced by 90% over the last 10 years. 90% reduction in the price of PV systems, which gives us the hope that linking renewable energy to desalination is very important, because 50% of the cost of desalination is an energy cost. So now you can really play with the energy costs so that you can reduce the cost of desalination. The other part is about membrane. And we are now in the research area moving from the reverse osmosis to another techniques like the forward osmosis, which is really using fertilizers, for example, to separate the water from the salt. So if we think in the future of desalination for food, it's a different concept, because the quality of water, we are not producing drinking water with the same quality, and it has to be that expensive. It can be cheaper if we think we are producing desalinated water for food. So what we were doing is using fertilizers to separate the water from the salt, but you don't produce fresh water, you produce fertigated water that you can use for agriculture with almost zero energy. So such ideas, I'm not promoting only this one, but such ideas that really think about water for food could be the future in the business sector. And we really have to see desalination as big part of the solution. But on the other hand, we have to think of desal as today, desalination is not a green technology. And to make it green, we have to do two things. A, being based or driven by renewable energy. B, is to find the solution for the brine. And the brine is the byproduct that's produced from desal. I'm thinking about the future of the entire region, the future of Egypt in the North Coast. When we push all the guys in the North Coast to move from the Nile water to desal, what will happen with the byproduct out of this desalination plant? Where you are going to dispose it? There's definitely one way to dispose it right now, which is the Mediterranean Sea. Disposing it in the Mediterranean Sea will have a huge environmental impact and other impacts. So, and this is not only for Egypt. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, all the entire Gulf countries are disposing the brine somewhere. And that's what we have to solve. We have to solve the byproduct and find the solution to move to what we call the ZLD, the zero liquid discharge. Desal without disposing any byproduct. That's what we have to do. That's the role of R&D. So it's not only about business, it's about research. So bringing researchers together with the business people is a key issue for making desalination in the near future, A, to be a green technology, B, to reach desalination for food security, because for our food, we consume 70% of our water resources globally. In Egypt, we use 80% of our water for agriculture. So if we can solve the problem of water for food, then we are tackling the big issue. And I'm sure with the business people, right business and right researchers, there will be a hope to solve the water scarcity issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. So 3 key messages. Climate challenges know no border. So we need cooperation, not only just internally, but also internationally. We need to marry the researchers with the business communities, and there is potential business prospect when it comes to water for food. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. I'm going to now open up the discussion. We're going to start with a panel member here, and my first question would go to Dina Saleh. Dina, when you start, if you could please introduce yourself, but my question to you would be, what are the barriers that prevent private investors from investing in adaptation projects? We have seen that private sector, they're very keen on investing in mitigation projects because it's very easy to see the impact. It's easy to feel it. It's easy to experience it. It reduces the GHG emission. It's very easy to even count it. But when it comes to adaptation, it's very different. So, Dina, what do you think are the key barriers for private sectors to invest on adaptation?
Thank you, Jahan, for that question, and good afternoon, good evening, actually. And seeing everyone here in the room shows the importance, at this hour, shows the importance of the topic. First of all, Your Excellency, thank you for setting the tone for us. I think you made some really strong points, which I think will also form part of my answers. And I think starting with the disparities that you introduced, Jahan, you know, when we listen to some of the financing that goes to mitigation versus adaptation, I think that already tells the story. You know, numbers talk. So we can already see that when you have 571 billion earmarked for mitigation, while 46 billion alone goes for adaptation, that in itself tells you that we really need to step up our game. And what the Global Commission on Adaptation has concluded, that with investing 1.8 trillion in resilience globally from 2020 to 2030, we would generate 7.1 trillion. So with $1 of investment in adaptation and resilience, we're looking at a return of $10. So this is really, for me, is mind-boggling. Now, to answer your questions, I see 5 barriers, 5 challenges. The first challenge, and I think this goes back to His Excellency the Minister's point when he said, how do we match business with the technical? It's really, what we see is that we do have insufficient, detailed national decarbonization and adaptation plans to prepare sound business cases for investment. So we don't bring the business case to the floor. And I think here, you know, if we look at very few NDCs have sufficient details on adaptation, infrastructure, that is for the infrastructure required, the policy changes that are needed to attract financing are not there, and of course, we have to look at credible cost estimates. I think if you want to attract investors, you need to be able also to give them something that is bankable, but is also credit-worthy. The second barrier that I find is, again, going back to the point that many of the countries that we look at, especially developing countries, don't have the necessary capacity to structure financing of adaptation projects. And I think this morning when I heard, I think the Minister of Somalia saying, we do have, you know, you do have technical people in the ministries, you do have people who understand what it means, but then if you have to make the business case, again, going back to the business case, if we have to negotiate financing, you don't have the right people who are there who can really match the technical know-how with the investment and the business case for negotiating. So here I think we need to look at an alignment of the technical project ideas with the legal frameworks, the de-risking, the incentives, all of these need to be aligned. The third, I think, challenge that I find is that the structure of financing itself, you know, there is an extreme complexity which holds back domestic financial institution engagement. And it was a point, I think, this morning in the discussions, in the, you know, when we had the Just Financing guidebook, we realized that a number of solutions are available locally, are available at the national level. But when we have to, how do we generate, how do we unlock that potential that exists in the domestic market, and the financing institutions, and I'm sure we're going to hear from our colleagues, the financing institutions, what is it that is required, you know, when you talk about having, you know, giving the national institutions the knowledge about the financing gaps that exist, and how can they use their instruments to be able to actually channel them towards adaptation projects, because in the end, what do? It's always for the high profit investments, which are normally consumer loans, but not really one that takes time, that is actually has a high transaction cost. So we need to be able to fill that knowledge gap for national domestic institutions. The fourth, of course, and just before then I conclude, I hope not take too long, is, you know, the global infrastructure for channeling adaptation financing. When we hear about, you know, many other global initiatives, and we saw, and you talked about, you know, the trillions that are there available. We heard this morning, you know, there's 410 trillion that's available from the private sector. But what isn't available is that we don't have a clear structure for how to channel this finance. And I think somebody said it this morning, why don't we tag, and I really like that idea, how do we tag the financing flows that go through so that we can be able to see actually that there is one structure and we can channel the money through that you know, mechanism. And of course, everybody wants an accountable finance framework. You don't want to just channel your money and don't see where it ends up. And the last, I think, is, and I think Your Excellency, the Minister of Somalia said it this morning, is the limited capacity of developing countries to absorb this increased climate finance. We can see the flow increasing, and we are advocating for an increase in the flows, but governments have the limited ability to absorb the additional resources due to conventional public financial management systems. And how do we program, allocate, disperse, and track climate finance? So again, it goes back to setting up the right institutions, the right mechanisms, the right facilities, being able to track them, being able to build capacities, I think would be my main calling there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. So we have a problem. The problem is complexity to structure deals. The problem is lack of capacity. The problem is lack of business case. We don't have sufficient details in these NDCs or national adaptation plans. And we also have a challenge when it comes to absorption capacity. So public sector says we have plenty of projects. Private sector says we have plenty of money, but we cannot find those projects. So Jennifer, my next question to you. How do you think the government can solve this problem? What will be their role in adaptation projects? And how do you think government can coordinate better with the public sector, with the private sector, I beg your pardon, and the development partners? What would be their role in terms of synchronizing the dancing?
So thank you very much for that question, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Honorable Minister, congratulations on your new job. I thought I was the new kid on the block because until 2 months ago, I was the Global Director for Water at the World Bank, and I've just become the Global Director for Climate Change, but you're 3 weeks, so very nice to see you in your new capacity. So congratulations. And so, of course, when I was invited to speak about adaptation, how to attract private sector finance and adaptation with a focus on water supply and sanitation, I was very pleased to do that. And I would like to focus my response in 3 areas. First, why investing in adaptation and water supply and sanitation matters. Second, the fundamentals that we need to attract finance, any kind of finance, public or private. And then a couple specific examples for crowding in private finance. And I'll look at wastewater treatment. So just before we jump into a discussion of specific challenges of adaptation, I want to remind ourselves, everyone in this room, the context of water and sanitation and water resources in the world, and the commitments we all made as a global community to SDG 6. SDG 6 is universal access to water and sanitation to everyone in the world, and we safeguard our water resources in an equitable, transparent, and equitable manner. Sorry, I said equitable twice because that's important. But the world is way off track, right? We're not going to be delivering SDG 6. 2 billion people in the world still lack safe drinking water, 3.6 billion lack safe sanitation, 400 million in Africa, water, 700 million in Africa don't have safe sanitation. Behind these numbers are individuals. They're women, they're men, they're children who lack access to such a basic service. So iPhone's a great example, but just imagine that, right? Imagine you wake up in the morning and you don't have water, you have to go fetch water, or you have to wait to nighttime to go to the bathroom outside. This is a societal failure, it's a market failure, it's a moral failure. So the climate crisis is making it this much, much worse. And the Honorable Minister talked about that. Climate warming is wreaking havoc on the hydrological cycle. It's increasing water scarcity, variability. We're seeing increased evaporation from extreme heat. We're seeing floods, we're seeing droughts. So if you're thinking communities, local communities, have to adapt to this havoc, and they have a fragile baseline on which to build, because many, many utilities and water and sanitation service providers throughout Africa already survive. They're already struggling to deliver financially viable services, and the populations are increasing, the pressures are increasing. So this is the adaptation challenge, right? Before, we were always focusing on just making sure that we had enough pipes to be able to deliver water to people. Now we have to worry about water being able to channel through the pipes. And we're dealing with the shocks of long-term impact of droughts on water resource availability. And many of you heard about the Day Zero in Cape Town. This is real. I mean, even you have very well-functioning utilities, you also are having major problems with water scarcity. On the flip side, and the minister, you mentioned floods, right? Floods always get the headlines. Think of floods in cities that don't have sanitation coverage. Think of water running through the streets where you have untreated sanitation. What does it do? All that gets into the floodwater. This doesn't make headlines. This is also a huge sanitary issue. Cholera is reemerging in many cities in Africa after these flood crises. So this is why I think it's important for us to think about adaptation. It's very hard. We're always asked to measure what's the delta, right, between what is just service delivery and what's the adaptation side of the equation. And I think that's really important because it's very hard to tease out in the water sector. But anyway, it's not all doom and gloom. We do see solutions. We see solutions and good examples that can crowd in public, private, and blended finance in the sector. In order to crowd in the finance, just like you said, and it's been said all morning, you need a regulatory and policy environment that's conducive to this, that allows utilities to be able to deliver services, to be operationally efficient, to be accountable, and you need adequate tariffs and correct tariffs that provide the right subsidies to the poor and not subsidies to the rich. So this is an important role of government. You ask what's the role of government. The government is setting this policy framework, and then the other thing is that important, there's no reason to finance any utility with public money or private money if it's not creditworthy, if it's leaking water. Unaccounted for water, 50% of much of the water produced, expensive water produced in utilities, gets leaked. It gets lost around the city. So again, the basics, the fundamental basics of being able to manage creditworthy utilities to attract both public and private financing are important. Again, not all doom and gloom. Africa has some of the very, very best utilities, some of the very best private sector models. Look at Senegal, not just urban, ONAS, you have it in rural. You have Benin, Rwanda, wastewater treatment with a guarantee. I mean, very, very important ways of doing this. The costs are staggering, $150 billion a year is nothing compared to the climate change numbers, right? But we need to remember that, how important it is. So we do need private investment. We need innovative financing. There's all kinds of ranges of how the private sector can engage, from concessions to the actual financing. And I think maybe whoever designed this session, the reason why they cherry-picked, let's talk about desal, and let's talk about wastewater treatment, many ways that the private sector is coming into the water sector is because they can ring fence and protect an investment. So if they can provide bulk water, be it through desal, and they can sell it and have a guaranteed offtake price, they don't have to mess around with the complex distribution system. And the same thing with wastewater treatment, right? So if you could treat the wastewater, you get paid for that. So this is really, really important when you talk about risk allocation. It's not in the abstract. It gets very technical fast, and I'm sorry if I'm getting too technical. Just tell me to stop. I also think one point that's really important is that the sanitation sector is incredible for mitigation. It's a hidden gem, and it's for methane. If we think about it, right now, we can attract investment in wastewater treatment. Wastewater sector now emits an estimated about 7 to 10% of methane emissions. Methane's the worst of all greenhouse gases, right? It's 30% more potent than just carbon dioxide. So if we can invest we think of wastewater treatment not out of sight, out of mind, but a huge resource. Wastewater treatment can generate revenue streams in new water, like you're saying, wastewater reuse. It can generate carbon credits. It can generate methane capture that can be transformed into energy that can be used to run the sanitation, the wastewater treatment plant. It can create fertilizer for the food, organic fertilizer. So there's a lot of win-win-wins that when you look at the private sector opportunities. I don't want to keep on going. I do have a couple of examples. I don't know if you want me to do that later. So then later on I will come back because we do have good, like I said, we have really good examples on how we can move this agenda forward. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and we look forward to those solutions, specific examples. But I wanted to elaborate on the role of government in terms of creating that enabling and, very importantly, transparent environment for investors. So that will be my question to Marina. We're going to keep to World Bank and would like to hear what World Bank is doing in this area. Marina?
No, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here today. And Your Excellency, congratulations on your appointment. And it's my honor to be on a panel with you during what must be one of your first panels. So I'll make a couple of quick points. And I realize it's late in the day. And it's great to have still a large audience in the room. So the first point is that I think we all agree the private sector is absolutely critical, not only for its financing, but also because of the role it plays in innovation and as a provider of climate-friendly goods and services. So we're having a really important discussion on bankable projects, and I appreciate the way you put the focus on that. And just also want to acknowledge the government of Egypt's initiative, the NWAFI initiative, which I think is really critical in the way it helps to transform the national climate change strategy into a concrete project in a very government-led way, bringing in different stakeholders, development partners, but also the private sector. And we at the World Bank are fully committed to supporting that process. And actually at the World Bank right now, we are financing our new, we're finalizing our new country partnership framework strategy with Egypt. And definitely some of the projects under the NWAFI will also feature in that new strategy that we're currently discussing with the government of Egypt. So my colleague Jennifer already mentioned that what we need for bankable projects is a predictable and a secure and a sustainable revenue stream. And I think that's absolutely critical in all sectors, including desal. And then some of the reforms we look at is the pricing of water, the reducing of technical and commercial losses, but also ensuring that the utilities are governed in a sustainable way, are run very well. And from where we sit at the World Bank, managing demand, but also ensuring inclusion, ensuring that subsidies are targeted at those that can't pay for themselves. These are all absolutely critical reform measures. So in Egypt, we've worked very closely, the World Bank Group has worked very closely with different government ministries, since water really impacts different ministries, as His Excellency also outlined, and also with the Sovereign Fund. My colleagues at IFC and at MIGA going forward are focusing on structuring some initial transactions in a way that can help to bring in the private sector. We at the World Bank, we have something that we call a program for results, where we are active in the institutional and policy arena, supporting, for instance, the development of a national water and sanitation sector strategy for Egypt. And we also recently completed a study on strategies for achieving financial sustainability. And again, this is all critical for bringing in the private sector. So just a few final points. In the short term, and I think it's important to recognize that desal is an expensive way. It's an expensive way of getting water. So in the short term, improving the energy efficiency and bringing in the renewable energy, as His Excellency also emphasized, is absolutely critical, as well as building strong payment guarantees mechanisms to help manage and mitigate some of the risks that the private sector takes, and to also ensure that the scarce public sector resources that are spent, that those are spent as efficiently and as effectively as possible. Just in the medium term, and these are my final few remarks, really managing water efficiency and reducing commercial and technical losses is absolutely critical. The desal investments are large investments, so you want to make those knowing that the water is then used as efficiently and as effectively as possible. So let me pause there for this round and just maybe highlight that these are reforms that take time, and as many of other development partners, the World Bank Group is there to support the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, predictability, sustainable revenue stream, inclusivity, deployment of risk mitigation instruments, and reform is a marathon. It is not a sprint. I want to ask my next question to Pekka, and I want to focus on the engagement of the finance ministry. We talk about plans, but the plans are associated with a budget and a cost. And eventually, when it comes to our inward-looking revenue, we have to rely on the judgment and decision of the finance ministry. So Pekka, can you tell us how, in your capacity as one of the champions of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, you are trying to further engage finance ministries in climate action?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present a few ideas on what we're doing. But in general, when it comes to the role of finance ministers, in any role of finance ministers in any context, our job is really to make sure that the economic policy is a right footing, is credible and well managed. And of course, we are also in charge of developing the financial systems and pretty much the architecture there. And of course, we are ultimately also in charge of the financial management, access to sovereign finance, so debt management. So it's a broad responsibility. But then, of course, now we are in a new environment with the climate change and also nature-related challenges. And that's why we decided 4 years ago to start the Coalition of Finance Ministers. So our role is really to enhance understanding about what this means. There's a lot of learning to do. We need to understand these risks. We try to quantify them. We also need to understand and find ways, tools to manage those risks. So it's quite a job. We are now 75 countries and with very different backgrounds, many having very serious adaptation issues. They are present in annual budget planning, whereas then there are countries where such pressure is not yet so visible. But that's where we come from. We work on the basis of so-called Helsinki principles. It basically just means that we are driving a systemic change. So it's a long-term effort, but concretely what we are doing in the coalition related to the adaptation, there is a report coming up we have been discussing, but basically 3 things. First, try to put adaptation challenge into numbers and try to also understand what it means in the future. We know it's difficult, but we are, for finance ministers, we need to do that. So that's the kind of a development, developing also tools and modeling approaches, relying on a lot of expertise around us, institutional partners. We know World Bank and many partners are working intensively on these issues, so there's a lot of partners involved. But so that's the one thing, trying to understand, and we have asked our countries in a survey on how they actually do that. The second is, how do you manage that? So if you need to define credible ways to manage contingency planning. This is key to access also finance when something goes wrong, and this is also the message coming quite strongly from credit rating agencies that we've been having dialogue with. So need good strategies, good contingency plans. That's the second one. Then the third area is really kind of having to do with the more like international architecture, maybe the donor perspective. It's like how the ecosystem works. This is a global matter. It is in question in many other fora as well. But we are interested on, as finance ministers, are also governors in many international financial institutions. There are national actors, so it's very crowded. The ecosystem is very complex. So how to make sure that the money that is being used is done efficiently and effectively, because there is no money around, extra money around. There are serious public finances constraints now in many countries generally. So that's really, and maybe on that, I would like to make two final points. It's really important that we also, not only with the institutional partners, but only horizontally work, for example, with the development partners. Finland, for example, has been active on that stage. So trying to bring horizontal cooperation. So finance ministries should not play the role as safeguarding their budgets anymore. It's more like proactively designing policies together with other partners, and it's a big cultural change, I think, for the finance ministers. That's why it will take its time. We just had next door an hour ago a discussion about green budgeting, and I think one point that I would just like to say that just the same as with the private sector, there are disclosure rules that are being developed. It's a major global effort driven by G20 and others. And also the same way, we also would need to promote the transparency of management of public finances, particularly when it comes to disclosure and reporting of climate, reporting on climate action and their impact. That's really, I think, key to promoting incentives and driving, be it private or public, whatever financing there is. My last point is on the instruments. We are also working, this is not the financial instruments, I mean green bonds, blended financing instruments and others have been discussed here a lot. This is not really, the instruments are important, they are not really, there is no kind of a silver bullet involved in them. We are more like working on the fundamental issues, but they are really important, and also we need to understand more about how they are being designed and the relevance from the finance minister's angle. That's why we're also looking into that also in light of how to make the money flows effective. And that's basically what I want to say. It's really great that the Egypt as co-presidency is bringing these issues, economic financial matters, more into the discussions around the COP. So thanks a lot for that. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much. So we need the numbers to change the knowledge of the finance ministries. We need to then come up with a strategy to manage the process, and we need horizontal and vertical cooperation to convert that knowledge attitude into practice. So I think we have solved the policy dimension. Now I'm going to be focusing on the project side, and I'm going to ask Dalia a very difficult question. Dalia, are you ready for this? The question is how to measure financial benefits of adaptation projects. How do you actually establish the business case?
Well, all intervention on the esteemed panel paved the way that there is a business case for adaptation finance. And private investors have the right to earn high returns on adaptation finance. The fact that our system cannot monetize environmental and social returns is not the problem of the projects. It's the problem of accounting practices that fail to account for externalities. This being said, we need to challenge two fallacies or assumptions. The first, that adaptation finance is exclusively the domain of public or concessional finance. It's good for private finance, and this is what I want to prove. The second thing, that adaptation finance is not profitable and does not generate market returns. The risk return is defected, and this is a fallacy. Actually, we need to commercialize climate finance, especially adaptation finance, for all reasons that you just mentioned. We're talking about survival. And indeed, I mean, public finance, concessional loans, even if delivered, they cannot bridge the funding gap. They're too little. We should eye the $380 trillion of investable cash in OECD countries. Less than 1% of this cash is enough to fund adaptation. And Dina, you mentioned the business case. So the money is there, the business case is there. For every $1 invested, we can have benefits for $10. The business case is very clear for all of us. What remains is to address and revise our systems, our policies, to capture this benefit. So let us zoom on CIB and the practical case of a commercial bank, very much focused on the single bottom line. As we issued our green bond, and we're the first bank in Egypt to issue the green bond successfully in the midst of COVID crisis, because we realized that with crisis, you need to readapt and revise your systems. And we issued the green bond. And while I was talking with my colleagues at the department, and reflecting on the projects that came under the Green Bond, there were 2 adaptation projects. One for desalination, where we dealt with private sector, and the project was a commercial loan. It's not a concessional loan. It was profitable for the bank, and it generated over 7 million cubic meters of water, desalinated water, which is good to afford or avail drinking water for 80,000 inhabitants on a yearly basis, right? So it is for private sector, it was profitable for us, and it generated water for inhabitants. And when I asked them, what's the economic return? They told me, if the policy that has been considered by the government, and we're not sure that fresh water that will commit touristic areas to desalinate and would factor in the true price of fresh water, then the cost benefits would be there. So it's a problem of policies, and here I want to reflect on finance ministers and the policies. The other project was for wastewater. It generated over 12 million cubic meter of wastewater. The project was for around 158 million pounds, and it generated reduced losses of about 50 million pounds. So we have a practical case under a commercial loan whereby we proved that it is good for private sector, because at the end, adaptation is risk mitigation. The industrial sector wants to get water to maintain its production. So it's not adaptation, and it's a public domain. The other thing that we did, and I think this reflects on everything that my fellow panelists have mentioned, is that we decided, because we saw the business case in not only mitigation, in adaptation, and we will not be able to enjoy mitigation profits if we do not address adaptation, because it is survival, as Dina said. We decided to be more proactive and establish a new forum or think tank titled Climate Finance Innovation Brain Trust, whereby we decided that we want to enact a holistic approach. The World Bank and the IFC have several success stories. Whenever I browse, you really have wealth of experience and knowledge. And we want to connect the dots between commercial banks, MDBs. MDBs know how to structure a loan. Ministers, government, science, technology, investors. And this will entail establishing a governance mechanism for each project. Each project deserves and warrants a governance mechanism that focuses on the project and delivers on the following: creating revenue streams. It's unacceptable to have any project without revenue streams. Even if we think that adaptation finance is good for community, like building this dam, maybe you can establish this pathway with toll. So you need to innovate how to make sure that it generates revenue streams. Second is innovation in the structure. As His Excellency said, you can have a hybrid mitigation adaptation project. You can innovate in the structure of public-private partnership and the PPP. You can innovate in sustainable finance instruments like the green bonds, sustainability-linked loans, blended finance, and crowdfunding. It needs innovation. De-risking, we need to partner with MDBs, Islamic Development Bank, for the de-risking. And most importantly, because we have to respect private investors' needs of data and disclosure. So we have to have this, I was just talking to Muhammad, my colleague, a branded adaptation finance breed of adaptation projects that really observe the checklists, and they are branded, even rated. So Climate Finance Innovation Brain Trust, I hope, will get us to focus on projects under NWAFI. I hope it will get us to sit together in a very purposeful, impactful, serious discussion among knowledgeable people that want to prove the business case of adaptation finance because it exists. So this is our experience as a commercial bank. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Sometimes we have a tendency to get lost in the woods. It's important to zoom out and see the forest, not only for its benefit for mitigation, but also adaptation. Amaldi. Now, we have solution for policies, we have solution for project design. Tell us, how can capital providers now bridge the gap in adaptation financing?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to join this panel. So I think BII, British International Investment, formerly CDC, which some of you may know better than our current new name, BII. We've set adaptation resilience as one of our core priorities under our approach towards Paris alignment. And we're looking at that in two main ways, both ensuring resiliency of all our investments, as well as delivering adaptation and resiliency through our investments. We are, I think, as the panelists have all emphasized, facing similar challenges that in many cases, there is no clear business case. It's not entirely clear where the revenue is coming from. The metrics that are being used around adaptation are not necessarily appropriate to ourselves or to investors. And there are a whole range of other barriers that really make it more difficult to invest. That said, we launched actually at the end of 2020 at the Finance in Commons Summit with some other partners, a collaborative called the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative, which focuses on accelerating private investment into adaptation. And that is primarily, we're around 18 members and partners, primarily DFIs, some MDBs. We have bilateral agencies, AFD, USAID, who can bring complementary resources to the table to actually help overcome these barriers, because we know we really need to build out the ecosystem and we need to do it fast. We are, through that collaborative, we're focused on three main areas. First of all, trying to come up with more relevant, investor-relevant metrics. So moving beyond considering adaptation finance, which is an input metric, does not look at the impact of our investments, nor does it look at whether an asset is actually resilient necessarily. Looking at how to come up with a more common approach towards the way in which we assess physical climate risk, particularly important for infrastructure as long-lived assets. And lastly, how we can collaborate to build out the ecosystem. And I'll just focus now really in three main areas in which we are looking to invest more. So I mentioned the importance of resiliency of all our assets, and that is critical, that the upstream, the enabling environment is really incentivizing that, so that the project design phase, climate risk and resiliency is fully integrated at that stage. And so particularly where we have PPP frameworks, other procurement, absolutely essential to get it right there. Otherwise, we're not very hard to add on or build on the resiliency measures. The second, and this is actually one that is particularly, we're particularly focused on, we've actually, coincidentally, BII, we've hosted an event, a two-day event in Cairo this week, in old New Cairo, not as new as the new administrative capital, but New Cairo, where we brought all our GPs, our fund managers, and many of the portfolio companies to look at how to increase venture capital, early stage capital for investment in innovative technology solutions with a strong emphasis on climate tech, and within that a focus on adaptation resiliency services. And so we've had, and in fact some of the companies I think are going to be here today and maybe tomorrow that are already providing adaptation resiliency services. And what is very interesting, particularly in the ag tech space, they're combining fintech with agriculture practices, with more traditional measures to actually provide what is really needed now in terms of adaptation resiliency. So these are early stage technologies, so we do have to take more risk. We do, and this is a priority for our venture capital team. We do have now concessional funding to enable this, and actually a climate innovation facility, which we made our first investment in a company in Kenya last November called Pula, which provides a more innovative insurance, so a pay-at-harvest insurance, which combines with climate, parametrics to look at the extent to which, if a harvest is lower than anticipated, you look at how that matches with the weather the weather pattern of that year, and then a payout is automatically made, which actually, given it's a relatively straightforward form of insurance, is much more attractive to smallholder farmers who typically don't like to take insurance. The third area, and this is one I'd like to focus a little bit on because it relates very much to this issue of desalination and very much what we're looking at here in Egypt. I was here in May with our project finance team, and we had a number of meetings with various project developers, with the government, and looking at the potential for investing in desalination that can contribute towards a climate-adapted water system. And I think what is really important here when we look at whether it's a water supply measure or other investments, we need to recognize the systemic nature both of climate risk, but also the systemic characteristics of the water sector. I think that was referred to earlier. As we look at each individual asset, we need to ensure that asset is resilient, but we also need to be confident that that is going to be contributing towards a water system that is adapted to climate change over the coming decades. And that, very importantly, that is going to lead to resiliency, not just of the water sector, but critically the other sectors that rely on that. And so I really welcome and congratulate the government on the NWAFI initiative, because obviously the water, food and energy sectors are so interlinked, both in terms of the risk, but also what needs to be done to address those. So what we've been working on over the last few months, and we agreed to work on this with the COP27 presidency team, and also been talking to the Ministry of Planning, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Very keen to talk with your ministry, Your Excellency, because of course irrigation is a critical part of this. But we've been looking at how to develop a plan that sets out what we're referring to as a climate adaptation and renewable energy water investment plan, which, if you look at the acronym, is Care for Water. So we're looking at this, developing a Care for Water investment blueprint, not the full plan before COP, not enough time to do that, but developing a blueprint that looks at how different private sector investments can contribute to a climate adapted system. The reason we talk about renewable energy, because when looking at desalination, it's essential that you're not contributing further to the climate problem itself, because we know desalination is extremely energy intensive, and so combining that with renewable energy, which of course, Egypt is blessed with an abundance of renewable energy resource in that respect. And how, when we look at this, the plan that we're developing, we want to identify where individual investments in water supply, such as desalination, such as wastewater treatment, can contribute towards a climate-adapted system. But also, very importantly, I think, as was mentioned by the World Bank, looking at the distribution of water, how can the distribution of water be improved, and efficiencies within the system. And lastly, and I think probably, maybe most importantly, how to ensure most effective use of the water. And so one of the companies that actually is here this week is a company come from India that has developed precision agriculture technologies. And I know this is something the Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund also has been looking at very closely, is how can you bring precision agriculture in so that actually you really are promoting a much more effective use of water, and how you combine all of these and together can really deliver on a climate-adapted water system. So hopefully we will be able to launch the Care for Water program blueprint, and we do very much want to hope that this could also be useful for other countries across the continent of Africa.
Thank you, Emily. Honorable Minister has another urgent appointment, so he has to leave, but thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you. Thank you, Amelie. You identified a very important point, and that is engage the private sector from the very beginning of the process rather than at the tail end. I want to now focus on some of the success examples and want to bring a slightly different perspective, and in this case, refugee migration. So my question goes to Amy. Amy, what innovation are you bringing from IOM's perspective into this space?
Thank you so much for having me as a part of this conversation. As you know, I'm the Deputy Director General at the International Organization for Migration, so offering a completely different perspective. And what we do, at least half of our work, focuses on providing life-saving services and support for the people who are most in need, people who are displaced, whether it's because of war or conflict or increasingly climate change. And where we see most of our most interesting developments in this area is actually in our WASH sector. This is the water, sanitation, hygiene, where we are working on creating low-cost, innovative solutions for people who have very little to give, very little options, frankly. And we do this in over 62 countries, serving over 10 million people. And what we're doing is trying to find the most efficient, effective ways of teaching communities how to manage water, whether it's wastewater in camps, or how to increasingly work with desalinating water, or as land conditions become increasingly degraded. And what we know is that our engagement with the private sector is absolutely critical to doing that. First of all, it turns out that governments and international organizations aren't the most innovative when it comes to figuring out what are the best technologies to use in these situations. So we need the private sector, whether it is on innovative financing, whether it's on innovative adaptation measures. But the question is, why does the private sector need us? And that's, I think, at the heart of what we're talking about today, right? So I'm going to offer a couple of reasons, which we'll see how well they stick. But the first is, it's critical to have these private-public partnerships, right? This is something where we think together we can actually achieve more for the greater good of society that will actually have private sector impact in the long run. So first, I think one of our best targets, if you will, one of our best enablers is actually diaspora communities. Because we know that diaspora communities around the world already have an interest in engaging with their countries of origin. They already have an interest in improving situations and providing life-saving services and humanitarian sectors, or to the humanitarian sector. So that's one of our first and most interesting places where we have found partnerships. The second reason is actually to enable the building of capacity. So we already know, I was in a panel earlier today where we talked about how do we build jobs in a green economy. And one of the key takeaways in that conversation was actually there's a significant labor shortage here. We do not have the labor we need to address the needs, particularly when we're talking about things like wastewater desalination or other areas of work that we project into the future. So actually, there's an incentive for the private sector to engage in order to build capacity so that they too can benefit from having a skilled workforce. Finally, third, I'm going to give you four. Third, it allows us to create low-cost ways of serving all communities. So ultimately, one of the barriers to adaptation strategies is the high cost. But when we're working in camps, when we're working in communities at risk, we're actually looking for what can be very, very simple ways of managing wastewater and relatively low-cost ways of responding. So those solutions can actually be applicable to all communities and allow governments and the private sector to save money. And finally, it allows us to improve the knowledge of decision makers, whether they're private sector decision makers, whether they're government decision makers. We have great examples, for example, in Sierra Leone, working at coastal communities, And the measures that we're using in coastal communities have relevance to shipping, to transit, to others who are in transportation. There are some barriers to implementation. It's complex. Working with the UN is not entirely easy. We need to break those down. But there are some really good examples. For example, we have partnered in South Sudan. It's our first multi-year energy service agreement with this company, and they're supplying solar-powered, near-zero carbon electricity for one of our humanitarian hubs. And it's been highlighted by the Boston Consulting Group as one of the best examples of innovative financing and procurement modality in the humanitarian sector. So they're very, very promising examples that will have universal applicability and ultimately be to the best interest, not just of the communities we serve, but also to the private sector. And so for us, this is absolutely critical.
Great. Thanks, Amy. So alternate source of financing, Diaspora, for example, invest on capacity and also roll out existing solutions that are already out there. I want to go back to Jennifer, and this would be my last question. This could also be an open question for everybody, but I want to start with Jennifer. We talked about policy, and then you talked about, or you referred to a few successful examples. Maybe you can highlight one such example, Jennifer.
Sure. Thank you. And in the interest of the time, and I know everyone wants to go to dinner, I invite you just also to go visit the World Bank website because we have all these case studies and examples there. I'm just fascinated to hear all these examples here from the commercial banks. That's the nicest thing in this panel, how we can follow up. But there's an example from San Luis and Potosi, the whole idea of looking at water reuse with industry. So pacts between municipal water and industry. I think that's also very, very interesting. We have good examples on India, the Ganga. How do you innovate in financing? It's called a hybrid annuity model, where you want to keep the private sector there. The private sector wants to come build something and run, sorry, not always, but you really need them to operate the service for 15 years. With adaptation, the good interesting thing when you do that is because with adaptation, we know we're going to have to change sometimes. So we might have an infrastructure in place and a massive flood comes or another shock comes. If you have a private operator, that's also an interesting thing. We have a PPP financing over 15 years where you can do the adjustment over time for these unforeseen circumstances. And finally, we have a great program with IFC and World Bank called Rewater. We're trying to roll this all across Africa. So it's a branding thing that actually does exactly that, to work with different partners. And also, sorry, Water Under Fire with UNICEF. We did a whole study. We've been working a lot on this as well. So happy to share all these resources later. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anybody else? Dina, please.
Right, no, thank you. And it's just really interesting when I hear across the board all the panelists, we're all doing basically the same thing, you know, and we have, you know, this habit of working together, but not really working together, right? Just a quick example. I remember like 15 years ago, we started a program in Upper Egypt, which was called the On-Farm Irrigation Development in the Old Lands. And those who know Egypt and know Upper Egypt, it's very traditional, fragmented lands. There was hardly any infrastructure, and whatever type of irrigation systems were there was flood irrigation. So entering into that space was very difficult because you're working with people. They're the center of all this. And we were trying to get these traditional farmers to understand, and this is before the whole hype of the impact of climate change was really out there. And we're trying to get them to understand what is the impact of what they're doing in terms of water use. Amelie, you talked about the water management. And it took us 15 years. And this is, I think, we need to always remember that there are people at the center of this, and they have their own cultural, traditional practices. And eventually, and this is now looking back in time, we did manage to crack that. We did manage, and it took a lot of effort, but beyond the effort is that we put in the infrastructure, but there was also the partnership, the public-private partnership, and we added a fourth P in IFAD, which is the producer partnership. So we had to bring all these partners together to see the profits and the returns on this. So we moved from diesel-powered to electric, and now to solar-powered pumps. We moved from traditional fragmented production systems to more consolidated, aggregated systems. We moved from, pumping so much water to using, control systems. So a lot of transformation occurred over time, and I think it is possible. I mean, now it will be done in a much faster rate. It won't take 15 years. I think we now all have learned how to do it much faster. But I think that I just wanted to add that there are so many perspectives and so many experiences, and there's a lot that can be done based on all, the experiences we have around here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sure we are all feeling very hungry, so I don't want to summarize the conversation, but let me try. I think we need a journey, right? We are going to get into a journey all together. It's all about partnership. We need to set our direction, not only just set the direction, but also explain how we are going to be arriving at our destination. That is essentially our business case. We need a navigator. That navigator is going to be the public sector together with the private sector, who will decide on the destination and influence on how we are going to be arriving at the destination. We need passengers, of course. No journey is worth it without the passengers. Passengers need accessible, affordable water and food during this journey, so we need to ensure that they have that. And then finally, it's very important that the passengers can actually afford, including the refugees, can afford this journey. It has to be a just journey. I think that's all we have to say here in this panel. Thank you so much, everybody. And we hope that we have provided you with not only just a glimpse of challenges, but also offered some solutions that can be replicated, contextualized in other situations in other countries. Thank you very much.